So welcome back to Ask a Woman, our digital programme, talking to women who make big impact wherever they turn. And the woman we are really fortunate to be speaking to today has certainly done that. She is the co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has poured billions of their fortune into projects around the world, in Africa, in India, in Indonesia, 138 countries around the world, and of course back home in the US too. Melinda's also concentrating now very clearly on female empowerment and has written a book, The Moment of Lift, to talk to us about that. And I'm just delighted to welcome Melinda Gates.
Thanks for having me.
This is a great joy for us.
Thank you.
So good to see you. Let's talk a bit about why you're in London to begin, because you're off to Paris tomorrow to address the G7 finance ministers on digital financial inclusion, which feels like a very grand project, but could mean a lot for women and their empowerment.
Yes, so I'm meeting with the G7 finance ministers tomorrow because digital financial services, that is having a phone with a digital bank account, changes everything for a woman. When she can save $1 a day, $2 a day, when there's a health need in her family or the school fees come due, she actually has the money on that phone. And so it shrinks distance to a bank. Women will tell you they don't want to get on a bus, go to a bank, they're unwelcomed. And it allows her to have earning and spending potential. It's enormous.
So it's one of those areas which is a new place to look for enhancing women's lives, enhancing women who are on the margins' lives in particular.
Absolutely, and we know that. It's one of the new levers of change. We didn't have the mobile phone a decade ago to use. The other thing that's incredible, and I think one of the reasons it's captivated the finance ministers, is it will add $3.7 trillion to emerging economies by 2025, if done right, and 95 million more jobs. So again, we know from good research now that if a woman has a digital bank account, she's also more likely to enter the formal sector with a job. So it really can lift up women and they can help lift up their families.
And you've been doing work for the G7 before on female equality, so a really lovely extension of that work, I suppose, and a great honour for you to be called into that tent, I suppose.
A huge honour. And what I like about it this time is that we now have a practical, real, on-the-ground solution. So it's fabulous. We've been talking about women at the G7 last year, but this year we actually have something concrete we know we can roll out that works.
You've been involved in Africa in particular for so many years now. Do you ever feel that it's a sort of project without end, that you will live out your days trying to find ways, particularly to lift women, but just to always address those on the margins?
Well, I know I'll live out my days working on these issues because they are complex, they are very deep. However, progress is absolutely being made. And as we make progress on one issue, we have to go deeper and make progress on other issues. But when you do something like unlock digital financial service for women, it actually starts to unlock her empowerment, which helps fix so many other areas of her life.
But let's look at something that's making the headlines just today even. The WHO are about to address whether the latest Ebola outbreak constitutes a health emergency. When you see that suddenly come onto the horizon again, does that sort of shake the foundations of your work, knowing that there is a massive crisis potentially alongside all the other work you're doing?
It is, when you see, anytime you see a disease emerge like that, it's a tragedy for everybody involved, and it's very hard on the health system to deal with it, so I'm always sad when I see that happen. But again, this time we have a vaccine. That's only been in a couple of years. We've developed a vaccine that will help it from spreading as quickly as it did last time. So I'm hopeful that we'll contain it all the more quickly this time.
Talk to me a little bit more about your particular personal engagement with the women that you meet, whether it's in Africa or India. In your book, you talk really vividly about a woman, Mina, who said, please, will you just look after my children for me? They see this fabulously wealthy woman before them. To have that sort of put very directly to you, what was that like?
It's heartbreaking when you see any woman in these circumstances of extreme poverty, any children or family, Meena is a particularly instructive example, and I mention her in the book. She was in northern India. All she knew about me was I was a Western woman in a pair of khaki pants and a t-shirt, there to learn about her life and see how we might help. And while she'd had a good experience with the delivery of her latest son in the health system, we'd had a great conversation, but right before I left, I asked her, what are your hopes and dreams for your family? And she cast her eyes down for a very long time. And then when she lifted her eyes up and looked at me with tears, she said, the truth is I have no hope for this infant in my arms or my other son. Will you take them home with you? And her plight is the plight of many women around the world, and that's heartbreaking to see, completely heartbreaking. And when I'm there, I have to take that in, it's the reality. But then eventually, by the time I come home, I have to figure out what can we do for not just Meena, but millions of women around the world to help them lift themselves up.
I suppose it goes to that really personal moment, doesn't it, when you're a mum yourself?
Absolutely.
In that situation, I mean, your heart must have cracked.
Absolutely. I could hardly speak on the car drive back to my hotel. I was devastated. I cried in my room because to think what it would be like to give your child away, and I've held my beautiful 3 babies in my arms. No woman wants to be in that situation. And that's why we have to keep fighting. We have to keep investing. We have to keep saying what's right so that we can lift these women up and let them lift their families up.
There's been a lot of controversy here in the UK about the so-called white saviour syndrome of wealthy white Westerners going to Africa, to India to say, hey, I'm here, you know, I can help. There's been a bit of pushback against that here recently. What are your thoughts on that? Is that something you're very conscious of?
Very conscious of it. And I think I heard very early on, at the very forming of the foundation, former President Jimmy Carter came to visit. And I was alone with him, and he'd been working in global health for a very long time. And I said, President Carter, what is it we should know now at the beginning of our foundation that took you a while to learn so we don't remake a mistake? And he looked at me and he said, Melinda, any country that you go in and any community you go in to work in, the work has to be something the community wants, and it has to be their ownership. They have to own it. And if they want it and own it, it will be theirs. And don't put your name on it. Let them scale it up. Let them figure out what they want, and then it will be lasting change. And I've really tried to take that into account. And anytime we go into community, we're working with a nonprofit that's been there 30, 40 years, where the workers are even from the village. And I think that's the only way to do the right culturally appropriate work in context.
Just a sort of slightly side issue, but you've put billions into the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, spent an absolute fortune on promoting vaccines very effectively around the world. What do you make of the anti-vax campaign, which is emerging, particularly in the West, particularly in your own country? We're seeing it too in Europe.
Well, I think anytime we're putting something in our bodies, we stop and question, is that safe? And what I would say to the anti-vaxxers is these have gone through enormous regulatory approval for safety. And so that anti-vax movement to me is senseless. I meet women all over the world who will tell me they've walked 24 kilometers in the heat with 3 children. They're often pregnant because they know if their child gets that vaccine, their child is going to survive. And I think we forget that sometimes in the West. We haven't seen a lot of this death and disability in a long time because we've had vaccines. But you see death. These women have seen death in their villages, and they've lost children. And those vaccines are life-saving, and we're lucky to have them.
You talk a lot in your book, but you talk a lot very publicly too about female empowerment, equality. It feels as though female equality and empowerment is on the ropes in America at the moment. What do you make of it?
I think we have to all use our voices, everybody, to get equality in our homes, in our communities, and in our workplaces. And anytime you have somebody pushing back against that, we have to stand up and say, no, we know this is right. I think there's always going to be pushback on a movement like this, but you just keep working and you work harder and you push through it, and we will.
The House of Representatives condemned President Trump's tweets about the 4 congresswomen as racist last night. Would you agree with that?
Very much so. And I think anytime you have somebody make a disparaging remark about race or about a woman, we have to, as society, stand up and say, that's not right. And I don't think that's very hard to figure out. I think as a mother, I know what I say to my children. If my children said that to somebody, I would say absolutely not. So whether it's in your home that happens or in the schoolyard or at a national level, we have to stand up for what we know is right.
Do you think there's a racist in the White House?
I don't know. I don't know him well enough to know that.
But from what we've seen in the last 48 hours, I mean, this isn't a row that's gone away, is it, very quickly? He seemed to double down on his comments 24 hours after he asked 4 women who are US citizens to go home. What have you made of all of that?
I think global leaders should be true to our values as Americans, and I don't think the current president is doing that.
You don't think he's true to the values?
Not that of the people I know of who live in the United States, no. And so, you know, we should expect more of our leaders. We should expect them to be beacons of hope. We should expect them to be the ones that our children look up to and say, I want to be like that. So when you have somebody saying something that's outrageous, the world has to stand up and say, not okay.
If you were in the room now, what would you say to him? What would you say, Mr. President?
Not okay.
Not okay. Strong and sure.
Yeah.
What are the consequences for America, potentially, of having a man with these views in the White House?
I don't think we know the full ramifications yet. And I think it's why it's important for all of us to stand up and say what we know to be true and to be right. And what I know is to be true and right is that we have to lift up everyone, everywhere. No matter what their background, no matter what their race is, no matter what their gender is, this world can be better if we help everybody lift themselves up.
Is it a frightening time for America, do you think, potentially?
I think it's a concerning time in America. But you're also seeing our institutions stand up, you're seeing other leaders stand up, you're seeing women stand up, and you're seeing other men, enlightened men, stand up and say, that's not who we are or what we believe.
I mean, you've spoken very vividly about the obstacles that face women wanting to go into politics. Are there extra obstacles now, do you think, as we head into 2020 because of the tone and nature of politics in America?
Well, I think that what we saw in the midterm elections is what you're going to see in the upcoming elections, which is we saw women coming out in droves to run for office. We saw them at the state level, we saw them at the federal level, because women are saying, wait a minute, I believe in something different. And even though it might be hard for me, I'm currently a doctor or I'm currently a mom, I'm going to stand up and run for office. So sometimes you have not good things happen in the world, but then you have to look at what comes behind that. And so I'm incredibly optimistic about women standing up and saying, I'm going to run for office.
Why don't you do it, Melinda?
Because I like my current job quite a bit.
But I mean, a lot of people would look at the situation that you're in, your current job, all the work that you're doing globally. You're fabulously wealthy, you're a woman of profile. Some might argue you could really stick it to them.
Well, my job isn't to stick it to people. My job is to help lift up people everywhere. And I think, you know, the way that I get to use my voice today and the freedom I have to travel and to at times be anonymous when I go into villages, I learned so much that I think, I hope can benefit the world. It's partly why I wrote this book. Was, you know, these women have told me their stories and they've called my life to action, and I hope that in the position I'm in today, I can call many, many others to action. Both the US government, but also governments around the world. The UK government, we work with France, we work with many of the developing world governments so that they can help improve the lives of their own citizens.
What do you think the state of the special relationship is at the moment? We've just lost a female prime minister. She'll be leaving office next week. We've got potentially a prime minister who's coming in that people say, you know, could be quite a good ally of President Trump's.
It will be it's up to the UK to pick who their next leader will be. That's not my role.
Do you think there'll be a strong female voice emerging in US politics in the next?
I sure hope so.
Yeah.
We'll see. I mean, we still have a long way to go. Our elections are long, as you know.
I know. It builds up fast. You talk really openly and honestly about your own personal journey in your book. I asked this of Miriam Gonzalez Durantes when we talked to her for Ask a Woman. I mean, how does it irritate you if you get defined by being the woman who's married to Bill Gates? I mean, it is obviously, your partnership has had amazing consequences, but do you think you've ever stepped away from being defined by whom you're married to?
I do think I've stepped away because I'm speaking about women all the time in a way that Bill just never could. Because of his role, you know, and because of who he is.
You also talked about being in an abusive relationship before you met Bill. That's a hard thing to put out there. How bad was it?
It was a very, very hard thing to write about in the book. And it was very difficult. And it took me years later to grapple with and face what I had been through. But I thought that story was important to share, and share it in the way that I did, because so many women face either harassment or at times abuse. And even harassment in the workplace. In the US, we know if a woman is harassed in the workplace, at an 80% rate, she leaves her job within 2 years. So harassment or abuse, they're on a continuum. Neither of them are acceptable.
And to be clear, it was a sort of controlling abuse. Not
Very controlling.
Not a physical situation.
It was very controlling abuse.
Yeah. And it's something that stays with you even when you're unpacking things all these years later in the book.
Absolutely, because when you are controlled by somebody else, you lose your voice. I completely lost my voice for years. And yet here I was, a computer science undergraduate, an economics degree. I worked at Microsoft. I have the role I have now. But there were places I wasn't speaking up in my life even a decade ago because I had lost my voice in a certain way so long ago. And again, the reason I tell the story is that any time a woman experiences that, you are silencing her. And it is not okay to silence women. And we know so many women face harassment or abuse. And we have to talk about that so that we don't allow that as society.
The other thing you talk about in the book very openly is, as a woman of faith, brought up as a Catholic, a practicing Catholic, to be called out by the Vatican for your stance on contraceptives and how they can, in your view, help women in places like Africa. You were called out on the front page of the Vatican newspapers as a woman who'd gone astray. Now, I'm a Catholic. I know what the conscience does in those moments. How have you squared that?
Yes, so I'm Catholic. I was raised Catholic. I'm still a practicing Catholic. The fabulous thing was that I was raised in high school by a set of more liberal nuns, Ursuline nuns. And they taught me what social justice meant. They sent me out to work in the public school just 2 miles down the road from the private Catholic school I was in. I worked in the Dallas County Courthouse. I worked in the hospitals. And so I know my conscience is secure, and I know I haven't drifted afar. When you meet women in these countries that I go to in Africa who've lost children, lost babies because they've had them too soon and too often because they haven't had access to contraceptives, I believe in babies surviving. My conscience feels great about that. And so because there's a man-made rule about contraceptives, I have no trouble squaring my conscience on that issue. I believe in babies surviving.
So in your view, it is part of a sort of male position that the church has taken. Any sense that might ever shift? Any optimism that might?
I sure hope it might shift. And I think that, you know, one day if there are married Catholic priests, or if you allowed women to be priests in the Roman Catholic Church, that rule would go away. And you know, the Vatican Council recommended twice in the 1960s to the Pope, of 2 different Vatican councils, that rule go away. And the Pope came very close to actually abolishing the man-made rule, but they haven't yet. But, you know, churches and institutions sometimes take a long time to change. And in the meantime, I will speak my truth, which is to know that 200 million women are asking us for this tool that we use in the UK, we use it in the US, we use it many, many places in the world, and it saves lives.
So you're happy to be called out on the front page of a Vatican newspaper?
Absolutely. I assumed I probably would be, but that's okay. It's the right thing for families.
Just to wrap up, it's been amazing to talk to you over such a wide range of subjects. One of the things we always ask on Ask a Woman is if you, first of all, could impart a bit of wisdom for younger women who might be looking at the path that you've followed. What little nugget of wisdom would you give to them?
I would say surround yourself with people who believe in you, both mentors and sponsors, and male and female allies, because you're going to struggle. We all struggle as human beings. And when we have those moments, they can remind us our truth and help us keep up our self-confidence. And I think having yourself surrounded by people like that makes all the difference in your life.
And if you could choose 3 women, either from history or current or whoever, to be at your dinner table, who would you like to sit down to have dinner?
I think Eleanor Roosevelt. I'd love to learn more from her. Probably the author Ann Patchett. She's one of my favorite American authors. I just met her on my book tour about 5 weeks ago, and I'd love to talk with her more. And then probably my maternal grandmother. She was fiery, she was smart, she lived through some very difficult times, the war. She went back to work at a late age, and she raised 2 very strong women, including my mom. And I'd love to speak with her more about that now that I'm almost 55.
Well, it's amazing the amount of women we've spoken to. They nearly always say, I'd like one of my grandmothers at the table.
Oh,
it's
really?
Fascinating, yeah.
Oh,
so as soon as you
interesting.
said my maternal grandmother, I thought, wow, this feels familiar. It's a thing for women when they look back and they think, who would I be drawing my wisdom from? So
Interesting.
It's really fascinating and lovely to speak to you. Thank you for letting us range over such an amazing spread of topics, and we wish you all the best on your trip to Paris. Melinda Gates.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks so much for talking to us.